Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 27 December 2024. In February 2012, more than a dozen years ago, I wrote a blog post titled, If I Lectured on Philosophy of History. I've been listening to the lectures of Darren Staloff on philosophy of history, The Search for a Meaningful Past, which was produced by the Great Courses, which at the time was called The Teaching Company and was made available on cassette tapes. Listening to Staloff's lectures, it occurred to me as a kind of exercise that it would be possible to assemble a series of lectures on philosophy of history, focusing on the figures that Staloff had passed over and passing over exactly those he had discussed. So a complete complementarity between sets of talks on philosophy of history. When I wrote that blog post in 2012, I had no idea whatsoever that I would spend a year of my life talking about philosophy of history. But now I'm here, and it's been exactly a year today since I started producing episodes on philosophy of history, with the first being Getting Started in Philosophy of History, posted on 27 December 2023. Most of my episodes have been profiles of particular philosophers organized by birth date so that they fill out the year. Arguably, this is a nearly arbitrary way to organize material, which I could have organized chronologically or thematically. And there are obvious problems with the approach that I chose. I had to begin in medias res and presume a general knowledge of the issues, since foundational figures didn't appear in historical order. Ronca's birthday, for example, didn't occur until the end of the year, but in terms of historiographical influence, Ronca should have been among the first of those to be discussed. But it was an order, that is to say, the order of birth dates that I chose, for better or worse, and it did organize the entire year. You've probably heard that a good plan today is better than a great plan tomorrow. Though, on the other hand, I've had years to think about how to present a survey of philosophers of history, so my choice wasn't without a history behind it. I didn't follow the plan that I had laid out those many years ago in my 2012 blog post, but I did talk about some of the topics I had suggested at that time. And from what I've produced in the past year, I could assemble a series of lectures on philosophy of history a little more systematic than the order I have pursued over the past year. So, was it a year well spent? Well, the project really consumed my year, as it was never out of my thoughts for very long. As soon as I finished one episode, I was looking forward to what I would be doing next. I would say that I didn't bite off more than I could chew, but at the same time, I didn't chew every mouthful to the same extent, nor even to my own satisfaction. What I've done to date in my Today of Philosophy of History series has been made possible by the compromises I accepted. Before I started producing these episodes, I had a philosophy of history space on Quora, to which I had been posting for about 3 years. And that meant that I'd build up a lot of material over that time. I had a Word file on my computer, 900 pages long, when I started this project. Despite having posted for 3 years on philosophy of history to my Quora space, I learned a lot by putting this material in spoken word form. I was forced by my format to give a sketch of the ideas of a wide variety of thinkers, and each had to be somewhat self-contained and understandable on its own terms. I learned that I needed to write a spoken word script differently from something intended to be read. A trivial example of this is the use of contractions. I don't use many contractions in my writing, but in spoken delivery, it would sound strange not to use contraction. I read somewhere that Isaiah Berlin didn't like writing, so all his books were dictated. Consequently, they employ a lot of contractions, and now I'm in a position to appreciate that. Many of my written posts about philosophers of history were primarily quotations from the thinker in question, but that doesn't work well in spoken form. I had a comment early on suggesting that I break up quotes into smaller chunks, and I've tried to do that, but I haven't always been entirely successful in that. I could, instead of quoting, paraphrase the material in a way that works better in a spoken presentation. I know that can be done, and I've had a little experience in paraphrase. If you check out the Routledge Companion to Heroism Studies, you'll find that I wrote the article on science and the hero's journey. In my first draft of that article, I included a lot of quotes, but Routledge required authors to each obtain their own legal permissions for quoted material. So I made some inquiries and I quickly found out that I wasn't going to be able to negotiate that maze within the period of time that I had available. So I rewrote the article without any quotes, paraphrasing everything that I had previously quoted. I think it would have been better to use the version with quotations in it, but the paraphrase version is comprehensible, and I could do the same with long quotes as some of the long quotes I've quoted in the past year. But there are also drawbacks to paraphrase when an author has stated their own meaning perfectly clearly in their own terms. I briefly discussed some of the problems in paraphrase in my episode on Oakshott. And since I brought up my episode on Oakshott, a couple of people pointed out that I mispronounced Oakshott's name. I'm sure I'm guilty of mispronouncing a great many names throughout the past year, though I also imagine it's more obvious when it's a name from the Anglosphere that gets mispronounced. Sometimes before I record an episode, I checked for the pronunciation of names from various internet resources. And at times this was very helpful, but at other times I found a wide variety of pronunciations represented in a number of different recordings and no way to determine which was the authentic pronunciation. I don't have a direct line to native speakers of the languages represented by all the philosophers I discussed, so I had to make do with what I had. A lot of the things I've talked about in these episodes are things that I've been thinking about literally for 40 years, but I'd never spoken my thoughts out loud before. Honestly, it's a little bit surreal to have thought about and read about these things for so long and then to actually speak them out loud. Sometimes it sounds very odd, even to me, but as I said, I've had to make do with what I had to hand. Some of these episodes have been nearly identical to past written posts. Some have been entirely written from scratch, and most have been rewritten versions of earlier written posts. Starting out with this extant material made this past year's episodes possible. But I mentioned earlier that when I started this project, I knowingly accepted a number of compromises. Since I had this existing mass of material from which I could draw, I knew that I could easily produce a steady stream of episodes, but only if I was willing to accept many imperfections. I've learned in recording these episodes how frequently I misspeak, sometimes entirely swapping one word for another. I could call these Freudian slips, but the substitutions I've noticed don't seem to be particularly meaningful. And even if they're meaningful in terms of my personal history, they are irrelevant to philosophy history, so I disregard them. A friend pointed out that there's a good reason for athletes and their coaches recording their training sessions, and now I can appreciate that. I also unintentionally make unconscious substitutions when I'm writing rapidly, but I hadn't previously realized how often I do this while speaking, and now I know. So the episodes are filled with small mistakes, just like I've already misspoken several times in this episode, but I've tried to correct myself. And I've chosen to accept these imperfections as the price of being able to keep up my production of episodes. Except for a handful of exceptions, all of these were recorded in one take, and none of them are edited. Recently, I re-recorded an episode that had more mistakes than average, but while Spotify makes it easy to replace an audio file for an episode leaving everything else in place, I couldn't find a way to do this with video platforms without deleting the earlier recording and entirely replacing it. So in this particular instance, I changed the Spotify recording, but I left the videos as they are. I could have produced fewer episodes with fewer imperfections if I had recorded multiple times until I had minimized mistakes, polished the scripts, and edited the final recording. This would have limited me to an episode every week or two. Also, I've done everything myself with no assistance, which may already be apparent from the imperfections that I've mentioned. This has been an entirely one-man operation. I bought my gear used from people off Craigslist. I set up my recording without any advice from anyone and without even bothering to watch any videos on how to do it. I organized the project, wrote the scripts, recorded them, produced the thumbnails and descriptions, and cross-posted the resulting episodes to a number of social media platforms. It often happened that two or more philosophers or historians shared the same birthday, so I had to choose among them. For example, Karl Marx shares a birthday with the archaeologist John Garstang, so I recorded an episode on Marx since he was far more influential, even though I'm not particularly sympathetic to Marxism. But sometimes the choice wasn't so clear. Karl von Clausewitz shares a birthday with the Czech philosopher Jan Patočka. Patočka wrote a book on philosophy of history, and Clausewitz, of course, didn't. So by any criterion of significance, I should have chosen Patočka, but I wanted to talk about Clausewitz, so I did. If I had been better organized or more energetic, I might have produced 2 or 3 videos in a day, but that wasn't within my scope. Still, it was a lot of work. Has it been worth it? There isn't any conventional measure by which I could call my effort a success. I've had very few views. I earned no money at all. I haven't become an influencer, but I'm not sorry that I invested the time and effort. Also, I hadn't expected to earn anything or to become an influencer. I just wanted to speak my mind about something that interests me. My many years of writing blog posts and newsletters also can't be considered a success, so it has worked out like most of what I've done in my life. The only episode that I could say was marginally successful in terms of popularity was my episode on Ernst Jünger, which has just shy of 4,000 views. That's nothing compared to popular channels with hundreds of thousands or millions of views per episode, but given my obscurity in my subject matter, a few thousand views per episode would have been respectable. Besides the Ernst Jünger episode, I have 4 other episodes that have 1,000 or more views. Those on Arnold Toynbee, Heinrich Rickert, Jakob Burckhardt, and the one titled From Augustine to Machiavelli. Some of the episodes that I thought had a chance for wider appeal have had fewer than 100 listens, and I've been surprised by the number of views on some of the episodes I expected to have a very limited appeal. So my expectations didn't seem to have any relationship to what people found interesting. I haven't noticed any correlation between episodes and views, except that the handful of longer episodes I produced, between 45 minutes and an hour long, mostly have fewer than 100 views. Nevertheless, I've enjoyed creating the longer episodes: Copernicus and Our Place in Nature, Wars and Rumors of Wars, The Second World War Begins, Hubble and the Var Plate, and my episode on Henry Thomas Buckle, since I thought that these exercises allowed me to fill in enough of the background to make my point comprehensible and coherent. When I've spoken at conferences, I've always chafed at the 20-minute limit, so it's felt good to speak my mind with no time limit set on that. Although I should point out that a couple of conferences did allow me to speak without limit, and that was also a good experience. I enjoyed making some episodes more than others, and the longer, least successful episodes were among those that I most enjoyed. Some episodes definitely turned out better than others. For example, some had far fewer mistakes than others, but some are more satisfying to me than others because I said something that I particularly wanted to say. Among recent episodes, I was pleased with the episode on Leopold von Ranke and the episode on the coronation of Charlemagne, since they point to how I'm trying to do philosophy of history, which may appear a little odd to others in philosophy of history. Just as I've had a trickle of views, I've also had a trickle of subscribers, which has now reached 992 on YouTube and I think 103 on Spotify. In a year, I've covered more than 120 major figures in philosophy of history. I still have a significant list of figures I missed in my first year, and hopefully I'll cover some of them in the coming year. I may revisit some of the figures discussed in the first year, but I won't try to touch on all of all of them again, partly because I have said what I have to say on many of them, partly because I want to get to those I missed last year, and partly because I want to work on other material and go beyond what I said in 2024. A lot of my episodes are presumptively about a given philosopher, have in fact been little more than a pretext for me to talk about the things that interest me and the things I wanted to talk about anyway. This was transparently the case in my episode on Giovanni Gentile, for example. It was never my intention to present an encyclopedic survey. I could say that I've covered an encyclopedic range of thinkers, but not in an encyclopedic way. In fact, not long ago, I received a comment suggesting that the philosophers I discuss are more likely to be unfamiliar to many of my listeners, so I should spend a little more time introducing them and their work. And I've tried to incorporate that, but once again, not entirely successfully. It's like trying to paraphrase longer quotes and including shorter quotations and getting the pronunciation of names right. All of those things are easier said than done. I can work on them, I can improve, but it's never going to be perfect. So, what ought a person to do when they've invested a year of their life into an unsuccessful project? Well, obviously, one ought to double down on failure and continue in the spirit of a lost cause. So long as the reaper stays his hand, I'll continue in the same vein, and perhaps I will develop some ideas not touched on in my first year here. The projects that I've been working on, some of which I may produce in the coming year, include a series of talks on philosophy of science, not a systematic survey, but an idiosyncratic account of what interests me in philosophy of science, which you might compare to my past year as being an idiosyncratic account of what interests me in philosophy of history. Also, a series of talks on the idea of the good life as it has manifested itself as an idea in different historical milieu. That is to say, the good life taken in historical perspective, which is something that I like to talk about because I've talked so little in the past year about the relationship between ethics and philosophy of history, and that's something that I could make good if I talked about the good life in historical perspective. I have worked on a series of thought experiments on civilization, in which I'll take up a number of semi-random topics in relation to civilization, kind of like an introduction to thinking about civilization, but nothing systematic. And then, in a somewhat more systematic vein, a series of talks on case studies in civilization, in which I plan to discuss particular civilizations with an eye to generalizations that can be made from considering particular instances of civilization. So, like I said, this should be more systematic than the thought experiments on civilization. Further, in the future, fate willing, I also hope to talk about the ethics of space exploration and the philosophy of astrobiology. I have elaborate outlines written for both of these projects I just mentioned, as well as most of the earlier projects I mentioned, but they represent major efforts, and I don't have everything clear in my own mind yet. Some of the projects I've been working on for many years, so when or how they'll come together, if they ever do, I can't say. People sometimes say as a kind of warning that the internet is forever. I take a certain comfort in this, as it implies that these episodes someday might be archived and made available over the longue durée, updated as platforms and formats change, which would be satisfying for me, though I won't get to know whether or not this happens. It's always bothered me that when I die, it's likely that all of my papers and notebooks will probably go into a dumpster. I've often reflected on the fact that Emily Dickinson left all her poetry tied up in bundles in a room, having no idea of the destiny of her work. She made her sister Lavinia promise to burn her paper, and Lavinia burned her letters, but she didn't burn the poems, excuse me. Like Max Broad's promise to burn Kafka's paper, or Virgil's deathbed request to destroy the incomplete Aeneid, posterity enjoyed the benefits of these breaches of trust. Fate often takes strange turns in unexpected directions, and this is very germane to philosophy of history, a salutary reminder that we cannot predict what will happen. So, Happy New Year. And thanks for listening.